From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. And to get us set up on the markets, we turn now to Abigail Doolittle. And Abigail, I must say, it's been a wild ride yesterday into today. It's been quite a 48 hours.
I would think that your characterization actually as a wild ride or quite a 48 hours is true either way, because it really has been incredibly volatile. Yesterday, down in a huge way for the major averages. Up today, off of the highs, off of the lows, though, too, because at one point it almost seemed like not so long ago, David, that stocks were going to turn lower. So lots of volatility, lots of uncertainty. As for yesterday's big move lower, I think it probably actually has to do with last week's payrolls report, which this is a bit complicated. It would be easier to say that it was just a move off of too far, too fast. But last week, that huge payrolls report, the indexes had been up 40% off of the lows at that point. So the case could be made that that was actually a sell the news report because it was more than delivered. It didn't happen on Friday, but on Monday we started to have this rally for some of the haven assets, and then lo and behold, the volatility for stocks, and it looks like it will continue. Right now, we are having a little bit of the rotation back into the cyclicals, but that has not been the story on the week. Just tons of uncertainty on the week, and there we do have the yen and bonds climbing early on Monday. Again, a big tell on some of the volatility that we saw for stocks yesterday.
So Abigail, is there any way of knowing how much of this is on the fundamentals, I'll call it that, actual news about coronavirus or about jobs or about recovery, and how much of it is on positioning? How many people had really short positions they really took off yesterday?
You know, I think it has really to do with lots of uncertainty. Investors, quite frankly, don't know. So you had this huge move down earlier this year, clearly on the fundamentals, and then this wave of liquidity from the Fed to offset that decline. And then the fundamentals, it's uncertain. People have all these different views as to whether or not there's going to be a V-shaped recovery, a W, an L, or possibly something worse. So when you have a move up 40% more, you just have the markets incredibly tight, almost like a spring. Any piece of bad news will set it to the downside. There's just not as much conviction up near the top there. So you had the idea that the virus might not be as strong, or is coming back, excuse me. And again, that payrolls report, I actually think, just based on what happened with the haven assets earlier this week, that that the jobs report last Friday was a big driver for some of the volatility this week, David.
Yeah, got our hopes up maybe a little bit too much. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, the markets we've been setting have been really very, very volatile, in part because of concerns about the recovery and also what Washington can do to help make sure that recovery gets here and gets here soon. We turn now to Isaac Boltanski. He is Director of Policy Research at Compass Point Research. So, Isaac, always good to have you with us. Let's talk about what Washington is doing and can do. And before we go to maybe a phase 4, let's talk about what's already in the bank. What about the Fed? Where are they on their Main Street lending program, for example? Is that fully up and running, and could that help with the recovery?
Yeah, hi, David. So if we step back on the Fed, they have done an incredible job in their $2 trillion plus in bond purchases, which has been part of that wave of liquidity you've talked about. But I think there's been not enough focus on their 13-3 facilities, these specific liquidity facilities that were equitized from Treasury money in that CARES Act bill that passed at the end of March. Here are the numbers as to where we stand, and then I'll answer your question on Main Street. From those 13-3 facilities, the Fed has effectively $2.3 trillion in lending powers. Thus far, though, David, they've only spent or extended about $100 billion of that. And so really only 4 to 5% of their gunpowder has been used thus far in those 13-3 facilities. So what we're doing now is turning our attention to the Main Street facility, which is for small and mid-sized businesses. This is a big program, David, $600 billion and a whole lot of expectations. And my concern here is that it has taken too long to ramp up. And furthermore, David, it doesn't solve for what I think is going to be a broader solvency issue, depending upon which part of the market you're in. Adding more leverage to the capital stack for a leisure company or a travel company might not make sense, depending upon where we are economically.
Yeah, and it's an important distinction you make that unlike the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, which ended up being, it can be a grant if you keep the employees on board, with respect to the 13-3 facilities, as you talk about them, that actually is a loan. That has to get repaid sooner or later.
It's so important to make this distinction. You're right. The PPP was effectively a grant, but this Main Street facility, let there be no mistake about it, it is a loan. And that is why Chairman Powell, I think, has repeatedly said the Fed has lending powers, not spending powers, which really underscores the fact that, David, the Fed is not economically omnipotent. They can do incredible things in certain markets, which is why we've seen corporate spreads come in and the spreads for TALF-eligible assets come in. Those are two of the different 13.3 facilities. But you don't have that same announcement effect in the Main Street facility, and you don't have the same reality regarding grants versus loans.
And quite apart from the Main Street lending program, as I understand it, there is that chunk of money that theoretically the Fed can lend, but this is money that the Treasury has to put some initial money, the first loss money up on. Why hasn't it gone out the door? I mean, as we're talking about a phase 4, we haven't really taken care of the CARES Act yet, have we?
And so in areas we have, and so, for example, the recovery rebates, the nearly $300 billion in direct checks, those move more quickly than some of the other programs. The PPP had its warts, which we know of, but I think had some clear economic benefit, as shown in the jobs report. But part of the answer, David, has been highlighted by the past few weeks, I think, is that our financial architecture is a bit rusty. The fact that it's 2020 and we're still talking about cutting checks to people is a bit absurd. That's one point, and that is in relation to some of the direct benefits. As for the Fed, David, the Fed's really good at certain things, and the Fed did tremendous work when it comes to corners of the market like corporate bonds or asset-backed securities, commercial paper, the money market facilities. But they really don't have a history, at least not a successful one, when it comes to Main Street lending. And I think this is important when we talk about the Fed and political risk more broadly. The Fed, I think, is terrified of being tagged as bailing out Wall Street, yet doing nothing for Main Street. And I think that dichotomy is something that's really important when we talk about the Main Street lending facility.
So Isaac, close this out for us on what might come next. The so-called Phase 4, the HEROES Act, is what Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has proposed. Where are we on that? Do you expect that there will be yet another round? We heard Secretary Mnuchin this week saying he believes there needs to be something.
I am as confident as I can be in this economic and political climate that there will be a Phase 4 deal. And I think that the reason is there's this foundational agreement that I think can bring both sides together. Democrats want state and local funding, David, and those states need it. And Republicans want business liability clarity. And I think those two issues can be melded into the foundation of an agreement. And then we can have a broader discussion about unemployment insurance and industry-specific aid. But I'm betting that there's at least $1 trillion package that's going to be signed by the president by middle of August.
Well, that's the question. There is an August recess. So what's the deadline here, effectively?
Effectively, so what I'm telling clients is I think that we have something by the second week in August. As you know, the jet fumes and lawmakers wanting to get out of D.C. is usually a motivating event. That may slip, David, right? Because ultimately these calendars that we look at are up to leadership. But it's, in my opinion, going to be a mid-August event. At that point, then you and I can talk about the conventions, which will be starting right around that time as well.
There is that. In some way, shape, or form, exactly. Thank you so much to Isaac Boltanski of Compass Point Research. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Bloomberg's John Authers about whether all this market fluctuation may have something to do, actually, with politics. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston, and right now it's time for Bloomberg First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, European Union regulators have been given a green light to pursue deals with drug companies on developing a coronavirus vaccine. The European Commission will be seeking agreements to buy hundreds of millions of doses. The Commission says it will dip into an emergency European pot of more than $2.3 billion to help finance the vaccine research. India now has the fourth largest number of coronavirus cases in the world. A surge of more than 10,000 cases in one day pushed India past Britain. India's lockdown was imposed nationwide in late March, but has since eased and is now largely being enforced in high-risk areas. The spiking caseload came after India allowed the reopening of shops, shopping malls, factories, and religious places. In Hong Kong, more than 100 protesters marched and shouted slogans during a lunchtime protest in a luxury shopping mall. The demonstration marked a year since a clash with police outside the city's legislature. Protesters held flags that read Hong Kong independence and shouting, "Stand for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." A federal appeals court heard arguments today on whether it should order the dismissal of the Justice Department's prosecution of former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Flynn's attorneys say there is no role for the judge to play now that prosecutors have abandoned their pursuit of Flynn. Flynn pleaded guilty as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation to lying to the FBI. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much to Mark. Well, our colleague John Authers has a piece out on the Bloomberg today speculating that perhaps that big market sell-off we saw yesterday had more to do with President Trump's prospects for re-election than it did with things like the coronavirus or with jobs numbers. And we welcome now John to take us through it. So, John, thank you so much for being with us. When you read this, it reminded me of an Agatha Christie novel. You're playing the role of Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple. You line up all the suspects and eliminate one after the other, and you come up with one at the end. Tell us exactly what isn't the cause.
Okay, well, first of all, if we're going with the Agatha Christie analogy, remember there's always the possibility of Murder on the Orient Express where, spoiler alert, it turns out that all the 12 suspects planned it and did it together. And it's perfectly possible that all the suspects had some part to play in why market psychology came together to do what it did yesterday. But the one that I wanted to react against was the notion that this was a reaction to Jay Powell being bearish in his comments on Wednesday about the economy, because frankly, if he'd been any more positive about the economy, that would have worried the bond market. Bond yields would have gone up, and that would have been a problem for the stock market. He's basically on a very narrow ledge. He basically promised that interest rates are going nowhere for years and that he wasn't going to attempt to burst an asset bubble if it arose. It just struck me as ridiculous to suggest that this was a negative reaction to Jay Powell. And that was the main point that I was wanting to make. But if you look at the other explanations that people have offered, plainly there is reason for concern about a number of states that I don't think it's a second wave of the coronavirus, more a continuing breaking of the first wave. Yes, there are a number of states where it's still ticking up, although still not clearly at the kind of levels where they've got real reason to fear an outbreak on the scale of what happened here in New York. I didn't see anything about the coronavirus numbers yesterday that gave you any more reason to sell on the basis of that than on the day before or the day before that. However, you've got the entrance of retail, but there's no particular suggestion that suddenly lots of retail investors sold yesterday. And yes, you did have bad data from the unemployment claims, but we've had lots of bad data, and we've also had lots of good or relatively good data. I didn't buy that as an explanation. So my best guess, if you seriously have to come up with one cause, and like I said, I'm a sympathist. I sympathise with the Murder on the Orient Express here. The market falls very rarely have one sole whodunit person. If you look at the prediction markets, they have recently, rightly or wrongly, they are now very clearly betting that Trump is going to lose re-election, that Joe Biden is going to win. Perhaps even more significantly, they now see the chance of the Democrats retaking the Senate as being almost exactly the same. And that, we can get into all kinds of arguments about. Sorry, carry on, David, yes.
Right. No, I was just going to say, to carry the analogy farther maybe than it should, President Trump named a suspect yesterday, and it was, in fact, Jay Powell, and maybe Agatha Christie would have, maybe the culprit, actually named the suspect at the same time. But play that through a little bit, particularly the Senate goes and the presidency goes. What does that really do to the markets? Why does the business world hate that?
Because of corporation tax. Now, we can get into all kinds of arguments about Donald Trump, and most of us probably do in our private lives. But the one thing that was plainly very market positive that he did was cut corporation tax. And that very directly does help the stock market because it increases the amount of earnings that companies share with their investors and therefore justifies higher multiples and higher prices. If you have a Democratic Senate to go with a Democratic president, it's very clearly in the Democratic manifesto that they're going to reverse that corporation tax cut, which is extremely unpopular, certainly among Democratic voters, but apparently in the country as a whole. If that happens, that will mean that earnings will go down, that share prices, all other things equal, will need to come down to account for that. I'm not making any great predictions on how the market feels about Democrats versus Republicans, but on this very significant issue that caused a very strong rally in the market a couple of years ago, if that gets reversed, that will be bad for share prices. And it seems, if you look at the way the prediction markets really... Sorry, yes.
Right. Well, I was just going to say, give us a sense, you know the markets so well, how sophisticated are they? Because if you look at the states where there are rises in the number of coronavirus cases, I should say the absolute number, it's not so much the question as the direction. It is Florida, it is Texas, it is Arizona and California. President Trump doesn't have much hope in California, but he really needs the other three.
Yes, and that's another point. It's almost all of the above. It's been very strange how the Black Lives Matter protests hadn't had an effect on the market, and it's been somewhat strange that the market has rallied as much as it is when there's clearly evidence that coronavirus is not completely banished in a large swathe of the country, including a large number of important red states. And to some extent, I think, and nobody can prove anything about causation in the stock market, but if you put there's a combination of a number of things here. No, the coronavirus hasn't gone away, and oh boy, if it gets any worse, it's going to be particularly in states that matter to the Republicans, and it does look as though he is losing the politics of the Black Lives Matter protests. That's hurting him. And oh yes, we've received lots of research from the amount of research notes I've seen over the last week detailing what a repeal of the corporation tax cut will mean for EPS and for the S&P. So a lot of people do have this in mind. My best guess is that if there was any reason why an overbought market that had come too far too fast particularly sold yesterday, it was somehow or other these things finally came together to reach critical mass. We've still got months to go before the election. It's perfectly possible that these will turn around again, but that, I think, would be the best explanation for what happened yesterday.
Well, your explanation is far better than mine, that's for sure. Thank you so much to John Authers. He is Bloomberg opinion columnist. He's also markets editor for Bloomberg. Great to have John on. And we're going to go over this really tumultuous week on Wall Street. On Wall Street week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time tonight, we're going to be joined by Katie Koch of Goldman Sachs and Larry Summers of Harvard. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour. Today it is Microsoft, which is once again getting the ire from President Trump because of its refusal now to sell facial recognition software to police departments. But despite it, it seems to be up with the rest of the markets. Kaylee Lyons is here to explain what's going on with Microsoft today.
Yeah, it's not clearly taking too seriously the president's retweet here, a retweet of his former director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell, basically saying that Microsoft should be banned from getting federal government contracts because it is refusing to sell that facial recognition software to police departments. Now, Microsoft's not the only one making moves in regard to facial recognition. It follows a move from Amazon to put its own software on hold for a year, and then IBM actually getting out of the business entirely. But of course, this all comes in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, David, and this anti-police brutality movement, because facial recognition is still a relatively undeveloped business. It will be worth about $70 billion in the next 4 years, expected to be used in a majority of airports and hotels by 2025. But studies have found that the software has racial bias, misidentifying people of color up to 100. They were 100 more times more likely to be misidentified than a white man. So you can understand kind of the social considerations here. But to bring it back to kind of market financial implications for Microsoft in particular, it of course won that $10 billion cloud computing contract from the Pentagon, and its cloud business is really vital to its top line at this point. It makes up about 33% of revenue. So that's not necessarily something that you would want put at risk. And of course, this isn't just Microsoft that could potentially be involved with these cloud computing contracts. We know that Amazon has sued over the Pentagon's refusal to grant it the contract, saying that President Trump basically just has a political enemy in Jeff Bezos, David.
Well, that he intervened inappropriately in the allocation of that contract, and he was pretty outspoken about Microsoft at the time. At the same time, these contracts, they're large, without a doubt. They're cloud contracts, they're large. Are they material to these companies? Because Amazon and Microsoft, they are huge companies.
Well, it's a very fair point. I mean, $10 billion is a very large number, but it's all relative. And I think even when it's not just talking about government contracts in particular, tech regulation in its entirety has really been kind of brought to the forefront of mind in just the past couple weeks, not just related to Microsoft. You also have Amazon and the EU antitrust probe. And then even yesterday, Joe Biden, the Democrat, coming after Facebook and its policies, saying that it isn't doing enough to police the content on its platform, kind of reminding all of us that it isn't just from President Trump. Big tech scrutiny is really kind of a bipartisan narrative at this point, David.
Thank you so much, Kayla Lyons, for that report on Microsoft today. Coming up here on Balance of Power, we're going to talk with Kate Baker. She is from the University of Chicago, and she has a new study out about how we all feel about our healthcare system in the wake of the pandemic. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for First Word News, and for that we go to my friend Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The White House is considering severely limiting employment-based immigration visas as the nation recovers from the coronavirus pandemic. Bloomberg has learned one possibility under consideration would restrict people from entering the United States on several different visa categories, including the H-1B program for high-skilled workers for as long as 180 days. That would affect hundreds of companies and thousands of people. The H-1B is awarded to about 85,000 workers annually. Florida officials are concerned about the rising rate of coronavirus in the state. Cases rose 2.8% in the past 24 hours, the biggest jump since May 1st. And the state saw increases every day this week. Florida began to reopen its economy 5 weeks ago. More than 2,800 people have died. In Italy, prosecutors are questioning Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte about why it took so long to enforce a lockdown in 2 northern Italian towns. Doctors say the 2-week delay in quarantining the areas in Italy's Lombardy region helped the coronavirus spread rapidly. It became one of the country's hardest hit areas. Prime Minister Conte has said he's at peace with the decisions he made and that he acted on, quote, science and conscience. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, our healthcare system right across the country has undergone severe stress because of this pandemic, raising questions in most of our minds about whether we're now building up the resilience in that system that we need, but also, do we retain confidence in our healthcare system? We're now joined by Catherine Baker. She's the dean at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, who has looked into both of these questions. So, Catherine, great to have you back with us. Let's start with the first one. We're starting to see some tick up in cases in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, in California. The absolute numbers may not be that disturbing, but the direction clearly is disturbing. Have we learned from what we've done so far so that we have the capacity in a place like Houston to really deal with a spike up in coronavirus?
There's a huge risk in the rise in cases, both because of the higher transmission rate, but also because it limits our treatment options in terms of ensuring that we don't overwhelm the healthcare system, and also the testing and contact tracing that are so crucial to preventing a new spike. When we have lower levels of new cases, it's much easier to check everyone and follow up on all the contacts to contain any potential outbreaks. As the cases creep up, we lose those really important tools.
So you are a real healthcare policy expert. What do you think will change or has changed in our healthcare policy because of this pandemic? Where are we learning and improving?
Well, first of all, I think we're learning how important it is that people have access to care in a timely and affordable way. A lot of the time when we talk about health system reform, it's about expanding access to care for chronic physical conditions or things that people need regular maintenance for. But for contagious disease, being sure that people have access really quickly is vitally important for their own health, but also for the health of everyone in the community. And that's never been more clear than it is right now.
Are we in a position to sort of ramp up quickly to make sure people get health care in case there is, for example, a second wave, or perhaps a first wave continues in some states that have been relatively low to date?
I'm worried that we're not. We certainly need much more testing and tracing capacity. I don't think our contact tracing is ready for a system that might be overwhelmed by new cases. And I don't think that we have a great set of tools to balance the economic hardship that comes from closing down activity against the health risk of opening it back up. If we were able to have a more nuanced opening policy where we could keep people safe while resuming a limited amount of economic activity, it would give policymakers and the public a much more palatable set of choices.
So, Catherine, as I say, you did a study together with the Associated Press, sort of asking people across the country how we're feeling about our healthcare system. What did you find in that study?
There were some really surprising things, I thought. First of all, Americans are very concerned with access to healthcare for their neighbors and for their community, much more so than they are for themselves. And I think that's partly because of the nature of communicable disease, but it may also be because people are seeing in a such more salient way the cost of their neighbors not having access to care in terms of community health. So people are very concerned about how much the U.S. spends on healthcare and how much access people across the country have, much more than how much they spend on healthcare or whether they might lose their health insurance.
But one of the things that I found interesting in this study was they say we don't need to spend a lot more money on research and things like that. We're more concerned about the coverage issues.
I think that's right. And there was a lot of agreement about the need to have better access to care and higher quality care. But there was a lot of disagreement about the right way to get there, whether people trust the government or the private sector to improve quality, to drive innovation, to control healthcare costs, and to ensure access.
Catherine, I don't know. Tell me, do you have any way of knowing any political orientation of the people responding? Because we've seen in other cases, certainly you and I have talked about it, that sometimes Republicans tend to look at healthcare differently than Democrats look at healthcare.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things we wanted to get at. So we did ask people both their views on the healthcare system and their political party affiliation. And there were really sharp partisan divides on how people thought the pressing issues of our healthcare system ought to be addressed. So Democrats had much more trust in government to improve access and control costs. Republicans had much more trust in the private sector, although both Democrats and Republicans agreed that they had more trust in the private sector to drive innovation in healthcare than they did in the government.
Yeah, so that raises the question, Catherine. It may be that Republicans say, let's leave it to the private sector. Democrats say, let's trust the public sector. But were Republicans, by and large, satisfied with the healthcare system? Is there dissatisfaction? Because we saw that play out, I believe, in the off-year elections last year.
I think there is overall dissatisfaction with some aspects of the healthcare system, although I think that Democrats declared that there was a much more pressing need to increase spending on healthcare and to broaden access. So there were some differences on priorities. There were also a lot of differences in what people wanted their own health insurance plan to provide in terms of which aspects they thought were most important to themselves. Is it having lower premiums or having broader access to providers? Is it having more services covered or is it having lower co-payments? People have very different views about what they want their own health insurance plan to look like. And that suggests to me that it would be awfully hard to design a one-size-fits-all health insurance system that would satisfy everyone.
Okay, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate that. That's Catherine Baker. She's the Dean of the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And coming up on this program, we're going to get to talk with Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, about the right way to reform the way we police. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. There is a groundswell of support for police reform across the country in response to the tragic killing of George Floyd. It includes a bill in the House that would propose national standards. And we talked to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, yesterday about the prospects for that bill and specifically about the possibility of bipartisan support.
It's so much stronger if we can work in a bipartisan way. So far, what we've seen from the Senate is weak, but nonetheless a recognition that there has to be some change. But I leave that up to the Karen Bass, our distinguished chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as the chair of the Crime Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, working with Jerry Nadler, the chair of the full Judiciary Committee. I'll leave it up to them to have their interactions with the Republicans in the House as well as in the Senate, and hopefully with the White House. We do have an issue that relates to a qualified immunity doctrine that protects some police officers found to be engaged in misconduct from any, shall we say, exposure from families that are affected or lawsuits. So that is one area that has perhaps an area where we'll have some differences, but hopefully on the others we will not, and that we'll be able to find common ground. American people deserve that. American people expect it. American people are watching. We want to show them we've heard you, we see you, we've listened, we've learned how important this is to you, and we're going to do something about it. That's the question I was asked by George Floyd's brother yesterday when he came to testify before the Judiciary Committee in the Capitol. He said, I have one question for you. Will this become law? What makes you think so? What is different now? Well, different is the complete public awareness of the injustice of it all and the complete public outcry for change.
Any of us who've seen the video, not just of George Floyd, but also of other instances of police misconduct, know that there are some police we really have to correct. We have to get rid of them. We have to amend their behavior. At the same time, I'm sure you'd agree, the vast majority of police officers are doing a hard job and doing to the best of their ability. How difficult is it, on the one hand, to really police the police, but on the other hand, not be seen as really undermining them and being anti-police?
Well, I think that most of the police officers who are conducting themselves in a way that could be viewed publicly as responsible do not want to be painted with a brush of some bad apples that might be there in the mix. And so, again, policing the police is a responsibility that they have. But I also think that we have to recognize there's some racism that has to be addressed in our society as well as within our law enforcement community. And when we can rid ourselves of that, we'll go a long way to having justice in our policing.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. Coming up here, we're going to talk with former Secretary of Homeland Security Jeh Johnson. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis raised fundamental questions about civil rights and liberties in this country. It also raises some important questions about Homeland Security. We welcome now Jeh Johnson, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama. Before that, he was General Counsel of the Department of Defense, and now he is with the very important law firm of Paul Weiss. Welcome, Jeh. It's great to have you back, Mr. Secretary. So, first of all, before we talk about what we might do about this, police reform, which a lot of people are talking about, give us your sense of the nature of the problem. When you see some of these videos, not just George Floyd, but others, clearly something's wrong here.
When I look at that video of the officer snuffing out George Floyd's life by putting his knee on his neck, I think there is no level of training that could eradicate that kind of depravity from someone's character. And when I look at that video, the problem I see, frankly, is recruiting. What kind of people are we recruiting to our nation's police departments? Are we recruiting people who want to protect and serve the public? Or are we recruiting people who want to be the neighborhood badass, the neighborhood bully with a racist attitude in their hearts? And so I think it's incumbent upon police departments to look at the kind of people they're bringing in to their departments. And we all know that this is not a simple solution. It's nuanced. There are many, many, many good law enforcement officers, far more than there are bad. But to me, that level of depravity goes to the very fundamentals of the type of people that are allowed to wear a badge in this country.
So if the problem begins with recruiting, what's to be done about that? We talked with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi yesterday, and she said, listen, we've got a new bill out. We're going to have a national database. We're going to have a ban on chokeholds. Can you legislate recruiting?
Good question. And I have to say, I listened to part of your interview with the Speaker. With all due direct respect to Speaker Pelosi, who I think is a fabulous leader, I don't believe the answer principally lies in federal legislation. For one thing, Congress has disappointed us multiple times. Congress has disappointed me multiple times. After Sandy Hook, we all thought this will finally be the moment of change for better gun safety legislation. After Parkland, we all thought this would be the moment of change, and Congress was unable to act. I think the answer lies with local police departments, mayors, city councils, who really take a hard look at how we are recruiting. One other aspect of this, which is not necessarily the George Floyd murder, but others, like Eric Garner, for example. And of course, by the way, I can think of no legitimate reason for a chokehold under any circumstance. If Congress bans that nationwide, so be it. I can think of no legitimate purpose for a chokehold. But you look at the incident of involving Eric Garner, for example. I think there is an element of training that could make a difference there. Teach our nation's law enforcement the tactics of de-escalation. Every once in a while, it's incumbent upon a police officer to use common sense and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm in now a life and death situation over a package of cigarettes or a counterfeit $20 bill. Is it really worth it to escalate this encounter to that level because of a counterfeit $20 bill? When I was Secretary of Homeland Security, David, I commanded the largest collection of federal law enforcement agencies in the U.S. government within the Department of Homeland Security. And I used to tell immigration officers all the time, don't let one episode that is heinous, that is bad, undermine your ability to function and exist within an entire community. One incident can undermine, say, in my case, ICE or the Border Patrol's ability to function, operate, win cooperation in the communities where they need to exist.
So you have not only at Homeland Security, but also in Department of Defense dealt with many, many people who have arms, who are prepared to use them in the right circumstances. How do you police that, whether it's in the federal law enforcement context or in the military context? No matter how careful you are on recruitment, there will be some people that get in that shouldn't be in there. How do you really review that, make sure that you discipline and expel the ones that don't belong there?
Again, it goes back to the first inning. It goes back to who we are recruiting. It goes back to temperament. Clearly, there are far too many incidents where, for example, somebody enters with a no-knock warrant or there's an encounter and the victim is shot 12 times. Is it really necessary for the victim to have been shot 12 times? Is the officer losing his head and just simply emptying the magazine? There is a more disciplined approach. I can think of incidents involving the Secret Service, for example, where someone represented a threat to the White House compound, and this was an actual incident, and he was put down with one shot. And had that not happened, it would have been a really bad situation. So that goes to a matter of discipline and keeping your head, really. And the more training there, the better.
So the aftermath of that tragic killing of George Floyd and other instances as well led to a fair amount of civil unrest across the country, and a wide range, if I may say, about peaceful protests and also looting and vandalism and violence. What advice would you give to the authorities, whether they're state authorities or national authorities, on how to handle that level of civil unrest? What's the best approach?
Don't be unnecessarily provocative. We learned after Ferguson, for example, that military equipment, military-style equipment on the streets domestically in our cities can be unnecessarily provocative to protesters who are inclined to be peaceful. But when confronted with military-style equipment, the episode may turn to something very unfortunate. Now, David, you got to put it in several different categories. The overwhelming majority of the protests that we've seen over the last 2.5 weeks now have been peaceful. I participated in 2 marches here in Montclair, New Jersey last weekend that were entirely peaceful. I guess you could call me a protester. And the only police presence I saw all day were officers barricading the streets, protecting the marchers. Then you have peaceful protests that can escalate to violence. We saw a bit of that, and that fortunately has receded over the last week or two. And then you have what I refer to as opportunistic looting by people who are out on the streets, who don't even know what the underlying cause is, who are taking advantage of a situation for criminal purposes. And in these kinds of circumstances, the police have to be careful to use common sense and not be unnecessarily provocative to a very, very large crowd of people with the cameras rolling.
And finally, Jay, this is not simply a police issue, as you know so well. We have 400 years of systemic racism in this country. Your own family actually has been involved in a fair amount of this. As I understand, your great-great-grandmother was a slave. You have a grandfather who is a university professor. During Jim Crow days, I must say. Give us your sense of history here. Where are we? What crossroads are we at? What can we do going forward that we're not having this conversation again and again and again?
David, the finest example of presidential leadership in my lifetime was March 1965, when Lyndon Johnson went to a joint session of Congress right after Bloody Sunday and said, this is not a black problem, it's not a Southern problem, this is an American problem. We have an American problem right now involving excessive force by the police that impacts largely, if not mostly, the African American community. That is an American problem. Equality before the law is as American as the flag. And change will come if all Americans realize that we have a vested interest in solving this. This is not just a black problem. It's not just for African Americans to speak about and be upset about. Every American should be equally as upset about what we saw in Minneapolis.
And we got a Voting Rights Act of 1965 as a result of President Johnson going to Congress on that. What do we need to do this time to make sure we make further progress? Because we got the Voting Rights Act through. That didn't take care of the problem some people thought it would.
Voting rights was a federal issue and a federal right. I think the nature of the problem right now we face is one that can be solved largely through better recruiting and training by local law enforcement. Mayors, under the pressure of their city council, their constituents, their voters, I think should be and can be and will be responsive to the calls for change. Voting rights was a federal guarantee. The Voting Rights Act was passed because states in the South were resisting the idea. Here, I think we have a political dynamic.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. That's Jay Johnson. He was Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, and he is now at Paul Weiss. Coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power on radio, we're going to talk with Richard Trumka. He's the president of the AFL-CIO. They have a union representing police officers, actually. And we'll also talk with Carly Fiorina, former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, about leadership in the situation we have right now. That's coming up in our second hour of Balance of Power. We will be on radio. And this is Bloomberg.